Okay, welcome everyone to the first event from the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths for this term and this year. This is the second term of a series of seminars entitled Translating Global Critical Theory, which builds on last year's seminars and discussions. What is global critical theory? I'm really pleased to have Hicham Safieddine and Angela Giordani today with us to discuss their edition and translation of the book Arab Marxism and National Liberation, Selected Writings of Mahdi Amel, under the broader heading, let's say, of reflections on translating Arab Marxism. So this event will take the following structure. Basically, we'll have a dialogue around the translation project, around Mahdi Amel's work, about the broader conjuncture in which it occurred, and also about the interest and potentials of recovering this work in our own moment, and obviously delve also into specific questions of the nexus between theory and translation in this specific case, and in terms of broader debates about Arab Marxism. And after that, we'll open it up for a kind of collective discussion. So it'll be about half and half, let's say, about 45 minutes or so of dialogue, followed by 45 minutes or so of conversation between us. My name is Alberto Toscano. I'm the co-director of the center with Julia Ang and Vicky Bell. And we also have with us our deputy directors, Svenja Bromberg and Jacob McGuinn. So let me just introduce our speakers. Unless, Julia, are there any announcements or things that we have to tell people about before?
I don't believe so, but hi,
Okay.
everybody. I'm back from the other side. We'll have other events coming up, and we'll be announcing them as they get settled, I suppose, into our schedule. So for those of you who are joining us for this first time and found out however you found out, if you want to have a regular update of our activities, feel free to join our mailing list by clicking subscribe on our website, cpct.uk. Over back to you.
Yeah, and we have an event that has been confirmed in terms of it happening, but not in terms of the exact date and time. So Rebecca Carl and possibly her collaborators on that project will discuss a translation and edition project called The Birth of Chinese Feminism that was published, I think, around 2013. So that hopefully will take place either in February or early March. But again, if you join the mailing list, then you'll find out quickly about that. So without further ado, so our two guests today are Hicham Safieddine and Angela Giordani. Hicham is assistant professor of history at the University of British Columbia, here, so to speak, in Vancouver, where I am also. His research focuses on the political economy of finance and the intellectual history of modern Arab and Islamic thought. He's the author of Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon, published by Stanford University Press in 2019, and of course the editor of the book under discussion today, Arab Marxism and National Liberation. Angela Giordani is a historian of the modern Arab world with diverse interests in Islamic and global intellectual history. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia and is completing a book manuscript titled Scions of Ibn Sina, Arab Humanists and Islamic Philosophy in the 20th Century, and currently is teaching modern Middle Eastern history at Smith College. Okay, so I'd like to begin our dialogue today just by asking Hicham and Angela to perhaps set the stage by just telling us something about the origins, the genesis of the project, how it came about, what drew them to the work of Mahdi Amel.
Maybe I'll start, and of course, Angela can chime in. Firstly, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alberto, for this kind introduction and for inviting us, and thanks to the Center for holding this event. I can't tell you how pleased I am to have someone from the UK in Vancouver to have some sort of convivial intellectual discussions every once in a while, because it's not as common. I don't miss a lot of things about working in the UK Academy, but I miss a lot the intellectual vibrancy of the United Kingdom, and particularly London. So I greet everyone over there, and I hope to at some point come back and see some friends. So to get to your question, so this book, it's been almost a decade. Time flies since we started thinking about this and working on it. There's always been an intention to actually translate the work of Mahdi Amel, both within the larger intellectual leftist community in Lebanon and parts of the Arab world, and also specifically among Amel's friends and family. They set up a cultural center in the late 80s after his assassination, and we'll talk more about him. And they've always wanted to translate, believing that this translation is going to be a very important contribution to the history and the future of Marxism. And what happened was they always fell into two obstacles. Many of us are familiar at least with one of them. The first is the money. How are we going to get money to do this? And the second, more important one, the difficulty of translating his work in a faithful manner and finding the right people. So these are the two things that were in mind. With the Arab uprisings that started in 2013, there was heightened interest with Amel's work, and many young people in the Arab world were somehow, particularly among the left, were starting to actually quote Amel. There were, people putting murals of Amel. So this became again a subject of interest. And it so happens, not to get into too many details, at some point I was approached, and I was lucky enough to be able to find the money, raise the money, and to also find a wonderful translator who's Angela. And in my case, because of my background, I think I also have experience in translation. We were able to bring this project together. So the significance of this is really, in my mind, firstly, the dearth of translations of Arabic works to English. Translation usually happens from the hegemonic culture to the colonized culture. We really emphasize and believe in the reverse order, that we have to translate what's being written in the non-Anglo-Saxon world. And the second one is, I would say, within Marxist thought specifically, the different ways in which we can understand Marxism and how Amel can speak to that in conversation with other Marxists from the global South. The Indian school, for example, is much more present than the so-called, Arab Marxist literature. There's great work that has been done over there. There's great work that's been done in Latin America. But I think there hasn't been enough work done on the intellectual and theoretical level when it comes to Arab Marxism. Angela, sorry,
yeah. I just wanted to add to that. First of all, thank you, Alberto, and to the Center for having us. This is really special. It's especially since this new edition of the text came out that we're excited about with Leftward. I just wanted to say, just to add on to Hicham's comments about kind of the dearth of work on Arabic Marxism, Arab Marxism, Arabophone Marxism. I don't know what we want to call it. But this is a massive tradition, and it's a very sophisticated Marxist tradition. From the perspective of kind of a modern intellectual historian, an intellectual historian of the modern period, it is remarkable that a tradition that's so rich and so massive is just absent kind of from the our syllabi, from kind of our citations, and that's really what kind of on the level of on my discipline as an intellectual historian. This is how I came to the project. I'm not a specialist in Arab Marxism per se. I've done some work on it, mostly in the Egyptian context, but this was very exciting for me from that perspective, and also just kind of from a political standpoint. And it's not, I don't want to, I'm sure everybody in this group is on board with this idea, but unless we bring thinkers from the global South kind of into hegemonic languages, right? Like this whole idea of a global turn in historical studies and intellectual history, right? It's just, there's no substance to it, right? We can't introduce our students to these texts. They can't enter kind of our theoretical debates, right? This whole idea of kind of, deprovincializing our theoretical canons, the canons of modern intellectual history, right? It just, I think, is kind of meaningless without producing translations of thinkers who wrote in non-hegemonic languages. So that's just kind of a bigger picture, just a larger perspective. I think this is the perspective I came to the project with. And I was very excited when Hicham approached me for it. I was in the process of writing a dissertation on something very different in Egypt. And I'm so glad I did this work alongside that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Angela. I think having now a sense of the broader horizon, and also the motivation for this as an intellectual intervention into a number of fields, maybe be useful to give a sense to our audience of the intellectual and political profile of Mahdi Amel. Aside from your book, there's and we'll discuss it later, there's been a smattering of articles principally on these two issues that we'll discuss later, the colonial mode of production and his intervention into debates around Said's Orientalism. But obviously his work is of much vaster scope and import. So yes, maybe a sense of that biographical intellectual profile would be a good way of starting our delving into the book and your work.
So I'll, for those of you who joined us, we did, think about how we can answer these questions. So I'm not stepping in first all the time on my own initiative. So I'll start with talking very, very briefly, and there's an intellectual, short intellectual biography you're all welcome to read. But basically, I'll say that Amel himself, was born Hassan Hamdan. Mahdi Amel is his pen name. He was born in what is today southern Lebanon, and was at his time. And then he comes from a middle-class merchant family. He grew up in Beirut in the age of Pan-Arabism in the 50s. He was highly influenced by the rage of national liberation struggles across the world. His teacher was Shafi al-Hout, who later became a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So from an early stage, he was introduced actually to Marxism through al-Hout, who belonged to the left of the PLO. And within the struggle for independence, national liberation within Palestine and Algeria, before he even actually got really involved. From an early stage, those are the influences that Amel was, part of. And he also, of course, grew up in a country like Lebanon, where, the right-wing, laissez-faire, open economy, early maybe proto-neoliberal understandings of social relations and anti-colonial and pro-colonial movements were present contrary to the rest of the Arab world. So a lot of contradictions were present in his life at an early stage. And eventually he does travel and study in France, in Lyon, and gets also politically active with some of the Algerian movements for independence, then returns to Algeria after liberation, hoping to be part of this new man or new revolutionary society. And he does teach there, eventually gets somewhat disillusioned with Boumedien's government, and then returns to Lebanon, becomes fully member of the Lebanese Communist Party. And then it's in those years that he also writes and produces a lot of the work that we discuss. I should say that throughout his life, his intellectual trajectory was in parallel and conjunction and overlap with his political activism. Political praxis was something he was very deeply engaged in, and he was extremely widely read. We should not think of him as someone who simply read and commented on orthodox Marxism. He was, in addition to many influences, maybe Angela can talk a bit about that. He was very much aware of the postmodernist turn, the post-structuralist turn, all the way up to Derrida, in addition to his readings on dependency theory, of course, obviously by Gundar Frank and Romero. He was aware of Frantz Fanon's work. He really relied on Gramsci. So he was quite, avid. He was an avid reader who tried to debate all these things while also being active in public spaces that are not scholarly. So he was commenting on the press. He was commenting on political debate within Marxist circles. He was part of revising the ideology of the Communist Party in Lebanon to introduce this idea of national struggle as a primary objective, particularly in relation to the liberation of Palestine, and not simply a question of class struggle in the kind of internationalist sense. So that's kind of a very brief outlay of his life.
Yeah, just to add something briefly to that, a little bit more with an eye to kind of his legacy and his place in really the broader kind of panorama of Arab Marxism. Again, if we think of him, not just in kind of the Lebanese context, but in comparison with Marxists of his generation in Egypt, for example, who kind of were more kind of state-sponsored Marxism and allied with the Nasserist project and wrote for, big official journals like Talia, the Vanguard, a kind of famous leftist Egyptian periodical run by Lutfi al-Khuli, another kind of major Marxist. I mean, these Marxists have not had, their works have not had kind of the shelf life that Mahdi Amel has. I think in part because he was widely read, because he was very much engaged with really with broader debates and not insular in his thinking at all, right? He has in turn remained widely read, right? His works have remained widely read. In a way that a lot of somewhat older Marxists, but also Marxists of his generation, who were perhaps more famous in their time, are not to this day. So yeah, I think we'll come back to this a little bit and towards the end of our conversation and thinking about his recovery in the kind of in the present moment, especially after the Arab uprisings. But I guess one last note that I'd like to make, there's in the little bit of kind of literature on Arab Marxists in kind of the intellectual history of the Arab world that's available in English today, there's a lot of attention to Arab Marxists who kind of turned after 1967, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran of 1979, kind of had this, kind of reinvented themselves, whether as kind of neo-Islamists or as kind of theorists of Islam, or, as neoliberals, right? There's the kind of, the like transformation of the Arab left in these, neo whatever directions. Mahdi Amel is not in a part of that story. He's a different kind of Marxist. And again, the Marxism he's left behind is one that I think has remained far more relevant than that penned by many of his contemporaries.
build on that, the culturalist turn that took place is something he criticized very explicitly. Unfortunately, we don't translate a lot of that. He spoke about the Islamized bourgeois trend, not within Marxism, but generally broadly within Arab bourgeois thought. He also spoke about obscurantism in reference to the less liberal, so to speak, Islamist trends, and also some of his colleagues in this case in the Civil War of Lebanon that basically understood war as the absurd, understood war as violence congealed outside of the logic of political and class conflict. And I can mention some names, but they may not be as relevant. So these trends, actually, he was a critique of everyday thought. This is a book that he wrote. It wasn't published in his lifetime. It's one of the books I wish we could work more on and translate at some point. But yeah, that's just to point out to what Angela was saying. And how he actually did not. He was neither stuck in the old type, abstract types of Marxist orthodoxy, nor was he part of this neo understandings of Marxism or other trends that were, he didn't internalize the orientalism and the kind of self-flagellation critique of Sadiq Jalal al-Azim and other people, for those of you who know. So that's what makes him, in my view, very special.
Well, following on that note, maybe to get a better purchase on the specificity of his intervention in and contribution to broader debates in Marxist theory, maybe we could just begin by addressing what is the role of questions of theory and methodology more broadly in his work before we then home in on more specific concepts and debates. So
yeah, I'd be happy to start on that. It's actually a wonderful kind of transition from what we were just talking about, because the self-flagellating turn that Hicham just referenced with Hicham just mentioned with reference to Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, it's known in Arabic as kind of this an-naqd az-zati, this like self-critique that becomes, it's like the thing among kind of the Arab left after. So
we've lost you a little bit, Angela.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. You were talking about the Arab left.
I was talking about this kind of self-critique that happens after 1967 in kind of mainstream Arab left. I would argue that there's always been the impetus to self-critique and to kind of reflexive like criticism of what Amel called preformed thought, al-fikr al-mutakawwin, meaning kind of all like passed down, like received thought, whether from the Marxist tradition or constitutive of Mahdi Amel's thinking and of his rethinking of Marxist method, right? And I want to talk a little bit about this rethinking because it's how our volume begins with his prolegomenon to the theoretical prolegomena to the study of the impact of socialist thought on the nationalist liberation movement. And the point of this, we start with this and he foregrounds it, right? Because his project, which is basically to enable the formation of what he calls our own Marxist thought, meaning kind of the formation of a Marxist theoretical apparatus that can produce scientific knowledge of modern Arabs' historical reality and the major phenomena which constitute it, which characterize it, such as, underdevelopment, dependency, class becoming, sectarianism, Islamism, the culturalist turn, whatever, right? All of these phenomena and kind of themes that we try to feature in the selections translated for our volume. His basic premise is that Marxist theory as it exists, as a kind of a Western thought structure, right? Kind of, again, this is how like a system for thinking embedded in the concrete kind of realities of Europe, right? That this system as it stands is not kind of in actuality capable of accounting for these phenomena of the colonial reality of the Arab world and the formerly colonized world in general, but that it's imminently that there's a potential within Marxist theory that it alone can kind of explain these phenomena. And so why is that, right? This kind of that's potentially universal. Like why is Marxist theory, as Amel understands it, kind of uniquely capable of producing knowledge of colonial of particular realities kind of all over the modern world? His answer to that is, again, to come back to this point of self-critique, is that it is something that takes fixed analytics, right, that interrogates fixed analytics, that interrogates categories, that interrogates all kind of preformed thought in light of concrete realities, right? And because of its embeddedness in concrete realities that are themselves kind of always changing, right? It too must always change, must always turn back upon itself, must always kind of critique and question the very kind of formulas, the very kind of the very concepts, class analysis itself. We must ask if class analysis as it stands is capable of explaining X phenomenon, right? Like sectarianism, for example, is it capable of explaining this? And so in Mahdi Amel's thought, you have this kind of constant, explanation of a Marxist concept or analytic interrogation of it, rethinking of it in light of a particular reality, right? And it's constantly kind of pushing the limits of these concepts and reformulating them and kind of throwing them, up for question. And this is why, the experience of reading Mahdi Amel is at once kind of frustrating and exhilarating and confusing, and you are rediscovering, right, this what you thought you knew about class analysis. It's a really kind of wonderful, our friend David McNally described it as like being in a kind of idea laboratory with somebody who's kind of constantly trying to kind of combine concepts, interrogate them, break them apart, right, and see what's left.
That's great. Please.
If I could actually take based on all of what Angela said, if I can take you through some of the thinking that he did to actually move from what Marxism tells us to what he eventually says about, for example, the colonial mode of production. So Amel says, and to start from the preformed thought, that we cannot use these categories before we rethink the categories. So you can't get a Marxian category like class and just apply it somewhere. You have to first think of the category and then you have to apply it. So in this case, he says, and could be also a segue into the question of Edward Said, he says that Marx could not have actually, if we were to apply historical materialism on Marxist own thought, Marx could not have given us a theory of colonialism, because yes, he does talk about colonialism, but he talks about it from the point of view of understanding capitalism in a particular historical point in time in Europe. So actually Marxism itself, the tools of Marxism tells us we cannot actually apply Marxist thought as is to other places. So rather than simply accuse Marx of being Orientalist and all these things, and he defends him very strongly, he says, well, he couldn't have actually, objectively speaking, done this work for us. And there's a reason why Lenin goes way beyond and Luxemburg goes way beyond Marx, because that's much more advanced, but then eventually we cannot. And then he says, what was Marx trying to do? He was trying to understand his own reality. That's how he came to this theory of Marxism. So if we were to do this to ourselves, we have to start with our own reality. And unlike Europe, where capitalism emerged and formed over stages within feudalism, etc., our own reality, we as in the colonized people, specifically in this part of the world, we were introduced to capitalism through colonialism, not vice versa. We experienced capitalism as colonialism. So our starting point is colonial social reality, not capitalism. And it's this reframing that changes all of the other things that he does. is this reshifting that now, why do we start with capitalism? Because we're colonized. Because we understand our reality through the reality of the colonizer. And so we have to do this in theoretical shift to begin with. And like Angela said, he goes through this tortuous back and forth between concrete reality and theory, trying to, because, it's kind of like almost, I would say, metaphors are dangerous, but like a crustacean trying to break through the shell, you break and then reshrink, and you break and reshrink because you were born in it. There's no tabula rasa. You started with Marxism and you break out of it. So there's the dialectical aspect of what he does, and I think he does it brilliantly, even though inadequately in many respects, because again, this is a one person's struggle, and it cannot be just one person building a corpus or a new intellectual way of doing. Of course, again, in conversation with others, we can talk about some of these categories eventually when we talk about the CMOP, and how, for example, Ranjit Guha works with domination hegemony in a place like India versus what Amel does with it. So this is the kind of work we have to do to bring these people in together on their own basis. He says colonialism is the objective reality. He dares to actually, and this is some of the critique of CMOP, it's not sophisticated enough, it's not objective enough. He's like, no, this is our objective reality. It's colonialism. Obviously, colonialism took place in conjunction with the expansion of capitalism, but we start with colonialism. This is our reality. That's where we begin.
Well, then maybe we can turn to that now, right? In terms of maybe also elaborating on that that wrenching away from these fixed or congealed analytics, and trying to develop a highly sophisticated theoretical categorical work, but out of the specificity, which is not to say the particularity, right? But the specificity of,
I would say, yeah, not the exceptionalism.
Yeah,
it could be the particularity, universal particular,
yeah,
but not the exceptionalism. That was the
yeah. So maybe you could just, to the extent that one can do it, quickly encapsulate what he's trying to get at with this formulation of the colonial mode of production, or CMOP, and then maybe also how, I mean, one thing that I was curious about was what kind of resonance did it have at the time, and maybe, I mean, you've already mentioned Guha and subaltern studies as a comparator, but to think what might be its difference vis-a-vis other efforts to rethink, the critique of political economy, let's say, or just Marxist theory from a non-hegemonic or non-metropolitan kind of vantage, right?
Yeah. I could start off, and then also Angela can
this is
or if you want to say something, Angela.
The CMOP is Hisham's, this is
it's my
you have the expert on the CMOP here, right?
I try to be. I don't know, I'm sure you're equally knowledgeable, because you also worked with it such a close range. But you could also maybe, because you have a lot more also to add to this, by telling us more about how it resonated as well, and that's something you could talk about. So let me begin by saying that, first of all, Amel very clearly says, what I'm trying to do is he's not trying to develop new theory. It's not an abstract project. He wants to understand the relation of dependency. He says, all my life's work is trying to, and let's go back and situate ourselves in the 50s and 60s, where this relation of dependency, I still think it exists now in a very moribund, implicit way, but it's now much harder to argue for, especially with this post-colonialism, always creeping on us. But the point is that at the time it was very evident, but it was being rendered at the seams with the rise of the national bourgeoisie. So there was this debate about what's going on. So he wanted to understand dependency theory, and it's in the course of, because he wanted to understand concrete society, and he believed in change and revolution. So his theoretical tools were all intended to help the revolution, not vice versa. So he says, I came up with this colonial mode of production based on my extensive research into this dependency. And there's clearly some resonance, of course, with dependency theory. And Samir Amin, who's the most famous, not representative and articulator, especially in the West, is somebody obviously in the background, although he's not mentioned by Amel. So what is the colonial mode of production? So I'll read the definition right away, like literally, it's one sentence, and then I'm going to give some examples. And I would argue it's not properly and fully developed by Amel, but that's okay. He started this and he did what he could. So the CMOP is, and I quote, the form of capitalism. So yet again, it's a capitalist mode of production. It's not some other, alien mode, but it is one form of capitalist mode of production. It is the form of capitalism structurally dependent on imperialism in its historical formation and contemporary development. So I'm going to break down these things quickly. First of all, it's structurally dependent. So this is not class dependency in the simple sense of a comprador class sitting somewhere and doing the bidding of the colonialist bourgeoisie. So it's actually a very structural understanding, but it's not an Althusserian rigid structure, just so also because he was highly influenced by Althusser, but not in a dogmatic way. So first is it's a form of capitalism. It's structurally dependent on imperialism. So it forms in the stage of imperialism, which makes it very distinct from how capitalism operates in the center. So the periphery center is there. He wouldn't use actually periphery, by the way. And that's part of his new frame of thinking. In its historical formation, there's a lot of historicity in Amel. He's not a historian, but he's very interested in how the stages of takween, formation, of reproduction, and then of rupture happens through history. So he's very much has the temporality in Amel, and it's not linear, it's multiple. That's another sign of colonial mode of production. And contemporary development. So it's actually a dynamic model that's still in existence at its time. It's not just a blast from the past. And so what does this mean in practical terms? I'll give some quick examples, and then we can hopefully discuss this as well together. So the first, for example, thing he gives, and goes back to the point Angela made about class analysis, is class differentiation. So he doesn't say that there's no class analysis. On the contrary, class is key in a colonized place. But he says class differentiation itself is, and this is important, stunted. It's not there are no classes, or there are it's particularly stunted. And as a result, the struggle for class liberation is the struggle for this class to actually form. This is how he sees it. You have to struggle to form your own class. It's a very kind of, and it's the underdeveloped nature of the colonial mode of production. When people say, "Oh, it's not convincing enough," he says this is not a weakness of the mode of production. This is a characteristic of this mode of production because it's stuck in there. So class differentiation is one example. Political instability. We keep hearing about, there's instability in the global South, these constant coups, weak democracy, weak states. He says political instability is the stability of the colonial mode of production as expressed in class substitution and not class revolution. So there's class substitution that happens, which we can talk about how hegemony works in the colonized world. But this is class substitution, not class revolution. It's an expression of the colonial mode of production. He gives examples of how we can't use class in a standard way in Algeria with the Pied Noir and how they became part of the reactionary forces. How do you think of working class in a settler colonial state? This is stuff that's talked about today, but he was very conscious of that all the way back then. We can't think of class categories, working class, full stop, bourgeoisie, full stop. The bourgeoisie, he called them not the national bourgeoisie, the renewed colonial bourgeoisie. That's what he called them. So he introduced new ways to understand the colonial bourgeoisie. So I'm gonna, I hope I didn't speak too much, but I'm going to read a very, very essential paragraph about national liberation struggle based on this understanding of the economic mode of production, because he was grappling with two movements or two currents. One is nationalism, which was very much focused on this idea of, and of course this goes back to Leninism, that the national bourgeoisie are the ones who are leading national liberation. And the other contradiction, and I'm not saying that's what Lenin said, that's what was interpreted in some cases in the Arab world. Simply, this is a national struggle. We should put the class struggle aside for after liberation. And there's another which was very internationalist. It's all class analysis. We shouldn't care about the question of nationalism, particularly in Palestine. This was key, where this idea of Arab Jewish labor as being the mode of liberation, and we should forget about settler colonialism. So he was actually saying both are inadequate, and this is what he says: the struggle for national liberation is the sole historical form that distinguishes class struggle. So he sees it as class struggle. He doesn't say it's not class struggle. It is the form that distinguishes class struggle in the colonial structural formation. Whoever misses this essential point in the movement of our modern history and attempts to substitute class struggle with nationalist struggle, or reduces the national struggle to a purely economic struggle, loses the ability to understand our historical reality, and thus also the ability to control its transformation. So he articulated this understanding of this third worldist movement of, anti-colonial Marxist, whether socialist or communist struggle for liberation, which is neither purely in standard classical struggle terms, nor in purely nationalist terms. So again, these are, some of the ways in which the colonial mode of production was articulated by Amel.
Angela, would you like to follow up on that? Maybe also by giving us some flavor of how this concept, or a finer contiguous concept, circulated in that moment, or what a response he got from other Lebanese and Arab Marxists to this.
To be honest, I'm not actually that aware of that,
Mm-hmm.
of the in the time of responses then. I mean, the obvious, kind of contemporary theory that is emerging at this time that's similar is the one that Hicham has already mentioned of Samir Amin, right? This is what more people are familiar with this. But as far as kind of the reception of that theory goes in its time, I'm really not very familiar with it. I wonder if Hicham, where, if you're
I can
aware.
speak to Lebanese context mostly. I'm not as familiar with how it was received in the rest of the Arab world. But within Lebanon, Amel himself was frustrated, actually, because he was, in a way, by the 1980s, much later, cited as the figure of authority in Marxist theoretical articulations and Marxist praxis. And if he weren't influential in some respect, he wouldn't have been assassinated too, right? He was someone who was seen as the symbol and representation of a particular trend. But this is much later. In the early stages, from what I know, he was a lot of people complain, and they still do when I'm there, that they can't understand Amel. I didn't have that similar issue, but they complain about that. And I think, and by the way, just a side note, he initially submitted his essays on colonialism and development in French. And then the editor, Mohamed Dakrou, told him, why don't you send me an Arabic edition? And then he wrote. So he wrote in Arabic, which also, but that's not an issue in the Arab world. The point is that his reception, I would argue, wasn't as wide, but his public engagement was very much present, particularly, I would say, in the 70s and 80s. But he kind of stayed the course at a time. Like Angela also said initially, he was kind of going against the flow once we get into the 70s, in a way. So he remained very, very well known within Communist Party circles. But as far as I know, and what I've seen and what I've read and what I've talked to people from that generation, he wasn't someone whose work, in my view, got enough attention the way I think it deserves.
Precisely, I think because of this culturalist turn that we were talking about earlier, right? The Marxists I'm familiar with who are reformed Marxists, in reforming Marxists who I'm familiar with in this time and in their periodicals, like were obsessed kind of with different issues. And again, kind of getting more and more insular, while Mahdi Amel is arguably kind of getting less than like opening wider and wider and kind of really thinking about kind of how to universalize Marxist theory, right? Because as Hicham kind of explained in his wonderful kind of layout of the CMOP, right? There's this idea that that in Amel that the relation between capitalism and underdevelopment, backwardness, whatever, takhalluf, and dependency in the formerly colonized world, the causality between them is not like temporal. It's not, it's not linear, right? It's structural. So to really understand capitalism, right, you have to understand its coeval, right? This phenomenon of underdevelopment that kind of is imminent to it from the very beginning, right? So so thus to understand capitalism, you have to understand colonialism, you have to understand underdevelopment, you have to understand all these things that Marx was not capable of understanding from his historical vantage point, but that Marxist theorists in the Arab world and living the colonial reality are able to think through, right? So it's very much, I feel like this kind of theorizing and his mandate was very different from what other Arab Marxists were interested in and writing about at the time.
Just to stress this point, and I'm going to quote, because I should say that this idea of universalizing Marxism, it's not just about let's read this theorist so we can understand their part of the world, which is some of those ways in which this decolonization sometimes happens. No, he's actually speaking to capitalist theory in the center, and he says, and to build on this point at the end, because this is not about just the liberation of the colonized people. This is a universal position. It's not a provincial or culturally relativist position. And he says, the revolution against colonialism is the only path to liberate human history. He doesn't say just to liberate the colonized people. This is also a universal project, just to stress what was just said.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe we can prolong this also in terms of this question of the relationship between Marxism and the so-called cultural turn in the 70s by delving a little into something that's recently received some attention of the alas little or insufficient attention that Mahdi Amel's yet received in the Anglosphere. That is to say, his short book, some of which has been recently translated in the journal Critical Times, on Said's Orientalism, which is, of course, a book that did receive a number of responses from Arab Marxists at the time as well. So maybe if you could just give us a sense of how you see the place of this text of Amel's in his broader production, and also in that moment of its production of the late 70s, early 80s. And maybe also to if you had any reflections on how his response differed from those of some of his Marxist peers to Said, and whether that tells us something about the specificity of his own perspective.
Maybe, Angela, you could talk about the content of the critique or some of the milestones, and then I could speak a little bit about the context of what was happening.
Sure, yes. So to just we included a short kind of excerpt of his short book in critique of Edward Said's Orientalism, and just to kind of put it very simply, kind of the content of this critique, Amel is basically disturbed by something kind of fundamental in Said's thesis that other critics were also disturbed by, namely that, this idea of kind of Western culture as a monolith, right? And in Amel's terms, this idea that, Orientalism is such an inescapable facet of Western national culture conceived as a monolith, that its ideas are so hegemonic and pervasive that even iconoclastic genius like Marx can't escape this, right? And for Amel, this is problematic on theoretical and political levels, right? First, he takes issue with this very idea, this kind of, what he characterized conceptually lazy, unitary concept of culture that is defined by the thought of the dominant classes, right? By, the elite Orientalists, that this kind of elite Orientalist, formulation is just so pervasive in Western culture that, again, it's inescapable. And why is this problematic for a Marxist, right? It erases the historical class character of ideas, right? And moreover, why kind of politically this is so problematic is because it, in effect, also negates the possibility of the emergence of an antithesis to Orientalism and to other forms of dominant class thought, right? So again, this conceptual laziness on Said's part, according to Amel, right, is also a denial of the possibility of resistance, right, and to the formation of revolutionary theory. So it's, but again, this kind of, one can read Mahdi Amel and glean that this would be his critique, I think, of Edward Said, which is not to downplay. I think it's a very effective little critique. But as Hicham will probably point out, it's just a very small facet of Mahdi Amel's work.
I would, and even add to, go a little bit further. Not in the content. I think you've done that wonderfully. I mean, in terms of my critique of the use of Mahdi Amel's critique of Edward Said, if I may put it that way. So just a side point, Amel goes into a bit of a conversation or a discussion about what he says, and I haven't been able to, I don't know if Angela or anyone else has done this. He claims that Edward Said misquotes Marx, particularly in how he understands the relationship of Marx to Goethe. So the use of the verses of Goethe versus the excerpt on Said. Ironically, I'm going to be here I'm kind of torn in between Said and Amel. I don't have an allegiance to one only, so it's not going to be all pro-Amel. But ironically, he says at the beginning of this booklet, it's more like a booklet, and this goes to the point about the significance of this work. He says, I'm only going to discuss a quote that Said makes in his book on page so-and-so. And then he goes on to say of how Said took Marx out of context, but then he doesn't engage in the broader debate but he makes these very poignant points that Angela just made, which I think in many respects are valid. So this is just about the critique. But my concern is that a lot of times Amel's critique is instrumentalized to bash Edward Said by some leftists who are actually working and inhabiting the center as opposed to the periphery in a very, in my view, counterproductive way. It's a fetish, and they just want to run against Said as opposed to, in my view, much more important things to look at and deal with. And like Angela said, Amel's contribution is not unique. He doesn't, there may be some things in it that's obviously different, but I wouldn't say it's unique. He makes the same arguments about India, that this was Marx's attempt to say that the colonization was going to actually lead to, it wasn't condoning British colonialism, all the typical things we hear about. So I would just say, and I would caution against this obsessiveness of highlighting Amel's critique of Said. I think if we were to take anti-colonialism seriously in our part of the world, I don't think that's the priority. In my opinion. So I would just say that. And it's okay to make these judgments, because if we take Amel's work seriously, we have to be situated in the context of where we speak to power and try to actually speak truth to power. So that's all I have to say on that.
And I would just like to add something though, where I would like to see Amel's critique of Edward Said cited though, is in English language critiques, like is in the English language literature on the critique of the critique of Orientalism, critique of Edward Said. I mean, I think it's actually like it's I will say, especially I think for Arab scholars who encountered Mahdi Amel's critique of Said and then started writing in English in this kind of critique of Said tradition. I actually think his ideas are all over the place in some of these scholars. I'm not going to name names in some of their works, but it's never cited, and that just always very much irritates me. So anyway, there's, you know, we see it cited and kind of engaged with kind of too much in some realms and not enough in another. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that respect that the claim that he makes, in at least in the excerpt, obviously not having access to the broader original, but in the excerpt, is about this reversal, right? That Said treats Marx's analysis in this newspaper article from 1853 of British colonialism as a kind of appendix or consequence of the quotation, right? Like, or in some sense, it's the very fact that Marx uses this text of Goethe, which itself is this kind of crystal of that encapsulates Orientalist thought, then renders his analysis of colonialism basically an expression, right, of this kind of Orientalist invariant that is held in Goethe's text. And one interesting thing at the like more kind of you know, philological level, so to speak, is that and I don't know to what extent Amel would have had access to this text. So it's another text from Marx's journalism, but that Marx had used the exact same quotation to describe what British factory owners were doing, right? So the words, the words of Timur of drinking, you know, drinking nectar from the skulls of the slain, right? I think is the translation into English of that passage, is one that's used in the context of, you know, Marxist journalism about factory struggles as well. So actually, there isn't, for Marx, it's a very portable quote, which he then also flips constantly, right? Like he uses it both seemingly in that article as a kind of argument for the possibly, you know, with many scare quotes, progressive nature of imperialism, and in other texts, right, as something completely different. But it is also, I thought it was also interesting in that text that, of course, there is an element of really acerbic imminent critique, because he's basically saying to Said that he's not being a good philologist, right? Like he's not like that. He's not like, the relationship of the quote to the text is just not very carefully handled, which is, you know, in itself kind of intriguing. So maybe this is a good moment to turn to questions of translation, right? And obviously, as you've already noted, because of the you know, because of the specificity, even idiosyncrasy of oh, sorry, Julia has a question. I will pause and you can, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just reading the question from the chat, which is, what is the
okay,
exactly? It's
so I'll send in the link, though, with apologies to, since it's not their translation, but it's a one in critical time. So very quickly, you can check out the rest of the issue. So you'll find the Goethe quote and everything else there.
We're excited about anything.
Said quoting Goethe's.
Said quotes the East-Western Divan, and then Amel's critique of Said hinges on the way in which Said has used that quote in Goethe to then paper over or undermine the specificity of Marx's analysis of colonialism by just treating it as an expression of the sentiment that's already included in the go-to quote. I mean, that's a kind of a quick.
Do we have the go-to quote around or no?
It's the quote is in the site. I've linked to the Mahdi Amel text that has the quote within it, and then there's a number of other articles in the issue as well. So
cool. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so maybe yeah, since we're on to questions of philology and translation and like, just to get a sense of the specific challenges of rendering Amel's style, his style of writing, also as a style of thinking, but also, which I'm very interested in terms both of questions of culture and temporality, and that you've already breached in talking about the colonial mode of production. The question of the terminology, right, or the conceptual terminology, and I think for those of us who have not versed in any way in Arabic, some sense of, it's very interesting to me, like the way in which Marxian concepts, right, can either draw on other conceptual discourses and then refunction them, or become very neologistic. So one of my curiosities about Amel in particular and broader trends in Arab Marxism is kind of like, what is the logic or the pattern of the translation of Marxian concepts into Arabic? To what extent is it kind of technical neologistic? To what extent does it draw on pre-existing, intellectual vocabularies and then refunction them? And maybe you could give us some examples that might be of use in elucidating them.
I mean, I will say this, and I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the kind of Amel's obsession with questioning preformed thought, with questioning kind of received concepts. He does not just translate Marxist concepts, or like, right, he is very, like, often you'll read him and you'll see he's put the French or German or English or whatever concept word that he's engaging with kind of in the original language, and then he'll explain how he understands that, and then what he comes up with may be a correlate to this concept, but it's not an equivalent. And so this ends up being challenging for the translators of Amel, right? Because we cannot kind of in good faith use that original Marxist concept, or kind of, correlates in dependency theory, or, kind of whatever, like Anglophone, whatever vocabulary that's kind of, emerged from that tradition, to then translate Amel's concepts back, into English, right? So in our translator's note, Hicham gives an example of Hicham and I gave an example of one of these things, like, why don't we just translate, the Amel's concept of, basically the metropolitan bourgeoisie? Why don't we translate it as the metropolitan bourgeoisie? Why do we translate it as the colonialist bourgeoisie? It goes back again to this point that Hicham was making earlier about how class differentiation in the colonized world, right, is not the same as it is in Europe, right? The bourgeoisie in the Arab bourgeoisie, right, the colonial bourgeoisie is a kind of a pseudo class of sorts. It's not a true class in the sense that the colonialist bourgeoisie of the metropole is, right? So we had to figure out how, okay, we can't just do like, colonial bourgeoisie and metropolitan bourgeoisie. We're going to do colonialist bourgeoisie and colonial bourgeoisie to kind of reflect this distinction and kind of in agency and formation of the two bourgeoisies, right? And this kind of overarching kind of theory of lack of class differentiation in the colonies that Amel is foregrounding. So it really, like, to call it translation of concepts, it feels to me like a misnomer. It's this kind of formulation and reformulation, interpretation, new coinage, reconceptualization work. I don't know if Hicham, you want to bring up any other examples?
No, I think these are great examples. The metropolitan one, there's more challenges also Arabic English, Qawmi and Watani, which is national and nationalist English. I'm also, I don't know, not to break the flow, but I don't know if in terms of some people are saying they want to talk, or I don't know if in terms of how.
Yeah, we'll finish the dialogue bit very soon, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Not and I just wonder because it's with online it's weird because you never know who's seeing what. So I just figured, but you're of course you tell us when we what we do when we do. I just want to. This is a bit going back to the translation. I want to make this comment. I am personally, and I think Andrea is extremely happy when anyone does any translation, provided that it is done in a serious manner. It is done with the idea of being faithful as much as we can to what Amel stands for. It's not because it's now in vogue. I used to cringe sometimes. We spent 3 years or more working on this. I know it's long, but everybody was so excited and putting up things, and I would be really, they're doing this. I thought so. It's some of this is kitsch, and I regret that. And I also have a concern about, and maybe it's a bit enigmatic what I'm saying because I'd like to criticize people if they're present, not in their absence. This intellectual masturbation, I'm sorry to say this, that's taking place around some of Amel's work. And bringing it into conversations which in my view have nothing to do with the conversations he was part of. And at some point I remember in one of my talks, I was saying the relationship to dependency theory, and somebody says, someone who's now, oh, it has nothing to do with dependency theory. Amel brought this extremely new way, this talk, which is just about creating, something out of nothing. So sorry if this sounds like a rant, but sometimes I am frustrated with these attempts. It's ephemeral. It's very localized. It's not part of a commitment, in my view, to the seriousness of this work. Yeah,
and it doesn't feel like it's coming from collaboration and community. And this was very hard work that I would not have been possible without like Hicham and me sitting together working on Google Docs and kind of rehashing this stuff. Like this is not the work for one mind, right? Like I think if I'm all for there being a big Mahdi Amel translation project, but it can't be like one person, right? Like we can't be kind of territorial. Hisham's not being territorial right now. This is not territorialism at all. But it's just to say that like this is really hard stuff and it requires kind of a meeting of many minds to get done. And it's not and it does need to be I think there needs to be some conversation with the family and some conversation with the people who are bearers of his legacy in a way.
Okay, well, maybe on that note, I have plenty of other questions, but I am also, conscious that we also want to open up the dialogue to the audience. So I think this is a good moment, maybe to do just that. And so I invite you to raise your hand with whatever icon is at your disposal. But you wanted to make
Yeah, sorry, because we didn't get a chance, and that's fine, to speak about hegemony and these things. I will actually also share a link because I did write a journal article about Amel's understanding of the relationship of sectarianism to colonialism.
Oh, yes.
That some people maybe this is not the translation. Yeah. This is my own interpretation. So it's there if somebody wants to read it. It has I hope it is of some benefit to some.
Okay, that's great, and invite everybody to click on that link before it disappears. Once we're off the Zoom chat, you'll be like, "What was that link?" So click on it now. Look at it later. Chrissy, hello. I can ask him. Yeah, there you are.
Sorry, I'm just very slow with everything.
No worries.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating, and I'm ignorant when it comes to this tradition, so it's really fascinating. I suppose the first thing, Hicham, I really appreciate your candidness about intellectual masturbation, because we see that, wherever we are, regardless of the field and the context. So in a way, when I said I'm curious, is because I think it's really significant. I appreciate the candidness, and I appreciate that there's something, point to what you were saying, there is really an ethical and a political sort of decision to be made especially when it comes to translating work that could have immediate impact in terms of praxis, right? So I suppose I wanted to invite you to say more about the, I don't want to say like how specific is this kind of like, you know, what can we do to avoid this kind of, or to prevent this kind of unethical, or, you know, perhaps limited in ethics kind of engagement with those kinds of things, especially because Angela also mentioned, you know, speaking to the family and so on and so forth. So I'm just intrigued, and I hope this isn't, you know, it's not really in the spirit of gossip, because as I said, I couldn't care less about the, you know, the specificity of those individuals. The other question which I had, which I suppose is, yeah, more on kind of on the content. I would like to know more about, you mentioned very briefly that there was a distinction in the concepts between national and nationalist. I would like to know more about that. Also, I would be curious to know the extent to which Mahdi Amel's work is typical insofar as it argues for a national position when it is anti, or if you like, a nationalist liberation position, only if it's done in the name of anti-imperialism. So I would like to know more about the national aspect of the national liberation, if you like, and also to know how exactly is that articulated if, as you say, the project is one of liberation of human nature as such, right? So this is I very much understand that the position is one of, it's not a particularist Marxism, but it's still a Marxism that that concerns itself with national liberation, and as far as anti-imperialist liberation. And perhaps this also seems like a slightly, I don't know what to call it, weird point to make, but is there a distinction being made between nation and nation state? So again, in the sense is like, what is the analysis of the state, or what is the role of the state in in this colonial mode of production? Another connected point, and this is again, I was just really intrigued, and I just want to make sure I've got my head around it. So at some point you were summarizing and you said that whoever reduces the the colonial mode of production to a purely economic struggle is missing the point. I was thinking of purely, so what is wrong with a purely economic struggle, right? So is it that what we're missing is the class struggle, insofar as class struggle involves class consciousness? Perhaps this is an obvious point in a Marxist context, but I just wanted to be 100% sure. And then I suppose I was just more broadly interested in whether there was an analysis of extractivism or land. What was the relationship with understanding, yeah, if you like, the resources, extraction of natural resources and land in relation to anti-imperialist struggle. Thank you.
Do we go one by one? Is that how?
Yeah. We'll take one at a time. And
Angela, feel free. I don't know if you want to begin or you. So thank you for all these wonderful questions. That is a lot to cover. So I'll try to be brief, and hopefully Angela can help me as well in some respects. So intellectual masturbation, I also appreciate you pointing that out. Obviously we're not the thought police, and we cannot prevent people from intellectually masturbating. What we can do, however, is point it out when it happens, and we can also, in my view, produce alternative ways of looking at things. That's the best way usually to respond to that. So doing the hard work and bringing it out there. And sometimes I can speak for myself. I'm starting to change after 15 or 20 years of being more open about putting out my work. Like, this is the first time I share a link of something I've done on a Zoom, and I still felt uncomfortable. But sometimes, unfortunately, it's the other camp, so to speak, that is always out there doing the, and many of us who do this kind of nitty-gritty work are just, because I'm still think this is not as good enough, to be honest, the translation. So whatever. So the point is, the question of family is sensitive, because there's all sorts of, I think this work, of course, belongs to the world, but it would make sense to start there. It doesn't mean they should have monopoly over it, but it would make sense because that's where the context is. And it's not just the family as such. The family, it's the Mahdi Amel Cultural Center. They have also people like Ilyas Shakir and others who are not family in the strict sense. They're comrades. So the point is to be part of this, of that. From a external point of view, you do your best to look for what makes more sense. It takes time. My point is, like anything else, it takes time to sift out the hash from the wheat. So there's no formula for it. But the point is, like anything else, if you take it seriously, it means you have to spend time with it. It means you have to read with it and around it. It means you have to, like Angela said, be collaborative. It's not just, oh, let me get this excerpt and translate it right now. That's what I'm going to do and that's it. I move on. So that's the first thing. And if I miss the question of national struggle, he would always say national liberation. Nationalist has the negative connotation. National in a colonial setting has a positive connotation at the moment of national liberation. Remember, we're not at the stage of neoliberal regimes that have emerged, neoliberal autocratic regimes that emerge in many parts of the Arab world and other parts of the world in the 70s and 80s. So we're still at the stage of Nasserism, which I should not be lumped with those. Amel and many of his comrades, of course, had critiques of the petty bourgeoisie, which they saw as the leading faction of anti-colonial struggle. And this actually, he says, petty bourgeoisie are at the center of history in colonial reality. Speaking of CMOP, I didn't mention that. Whereas it's seen as parasitic in the capitalist world. So we have to study the petty bourgeoisie because they are actually at the center of history in the colonial space. They're not at the periphery like in the center. So economism is, in a typical sense, he was against economic struggle as an economism in which it's all about wage labor, it's all about material relations of production. There's no question of consciousness. There's no question of the distinction of class struggle in a colonial setting, which means the question of national identity and how it's formulated is different. The role of the state will be different. He's silent. He doesn't talk about the state as such. He doesn't bring it in an explicit way. But what is the way out? Socialism. So he does explicitly say, when it comes to severing the relation of dependency, that he says it's socialism. So he's clearly critical to any kind of free market or conservative order in the name of anti-colonialism. He's critical of that, but not in the economist sense. So I don't know. He doesn't elaborate a lot on the vision he has of what is the alternative. He says it's socialism. That's what he says. So he, in that sense, I think he protects his work from being co-opted by nationalists, Qawmiyin, while emphasizing that we don't want a typical economist approach of just working class versus the bourgeoisie and the struggle for better, living conditions. No, this is liberation on a larger scale. And the last point on extractive resources, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Angela. I personally read his entire corpus before I started doing this. I spent 3 months in the summer doing this to choose from it, all of it, with notes. And I don't remember him talking about it only in relation to the typical analysis of imperialism as a form of extraction of natural resources and the uneven development, which means the expansion of the he wouldn't say extractive, but the basically agricultural and mineral sector against the industrial and other forms of economic production. So that's where it lies, but I don't think he has a, conscious even or sophisticated. He's also silent on, for example, the question of gender completely almost, although he does talk about socialism as this liberationary thing, but in a typical, Marxist fashion to that time, he doesn't speak about it. So.
I have not read the entirety of. I did not spend the summer before this project reading the entirety of Mahdi Amel's corpus. So we're going to trust Hicham's answer. Although you should send us all those notes, I must say on this corpus.
Are you sure you can read them? Look at that. This is old-fashioned.
Yes.
I know you can, but
I wanted to come back to the question Mahdi Amel being in vogue, and let's say this. I think while there's this problem, there's also the problem of our institutional, of our departments. I'm a historian. I am my work and on this translation project is not kind of recognized as proper scholarship. I was strongly discouraged from undertaking this project in tandem with my dissertation. And I think the reason the kind of translation work kind of tends to be this like, oh, I want to publish this excerpt because, then it'll get people interested in the article that I wrote. Like, it's all incidental. It's not kind of real work that we're invested in, our institutions are invested in, that the discipline of history is invested in, right? We can't say this of literature scholars. There is that investment there. But, for translating theory, right, which I actually do think is especially Marxist theory about things like colonialism and imperialism and whatever, and capitalism. This is very much something that historians should be doing, and people in the harder social sciences even, but this is not something supported at all in our institutions. So that, to me, I think, I don't want to still there are some people who are, assholes about all of this and whatever, but we need to think about the structure. We need to think about the institutions we're working in and how this is not, it's just it's not going to be systematic until it's systematic, right? Until it's supported kind of on a larger scale. So, yeah.
Hey, other questions and comments? Please raise
I think
your
maybe
hands.
Ursula has some. Would you like someone, sorry, by the name of Ursula, seemed to want to express that we want to hear more from the audience if they would like to say something, or someone else.
I made my comment in the chat, but it'd be interesting to hear others' views.
Yeah. Oh, there's Svenja. Would you like to?
Yeah.
Chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also like Chris, new to the work and ignorant, but I'm really appreciative and really enjoyed the talk. I suppose I have kind of two questions, which which are both kind of about the colonial mode of production, because to me, it seems a really kind of interesting, but also in some ways, I don't want to say obvious because I don't want to devalue it, but in some, it feels like a concept that I'm almost surprised that this is the first time I discuss it in a Marxist debate, I suppose, in those terms. I mean, we discussed the relationship between colonialism and capitalism in many ways. We discussed the notion of racial capitalism, the relationship between race and class, race and capital. And so I was kind of wondering a little bit, because Angela, you spoke about the lack, or both of you spoke about the lack of a reception and engagement in a debate around that notion in the Arab context at the time. But I'm kind of wondering whether there is a reception up to kind of contemporary Marxist thought, where we had kind of a renewal of engagement with precisely the relationship between capitalism and colonialism kind of in more recent debate. So I'm wondering kind of, does that work figure in how we in the contemporary context try to understand the relations? And also, I suppose I'm wondering a little bit, like, what are like if we take the colonial mode of production concept as part of the arsenal of political economy concepts, does that kind of then allow us, for example, to understand the present? I mean, in some ways, I think like it's maybe a bit too simplistic to say, can we understand the contemporary crisis in Lebanon with the help of that kind of concept, or like I suppose the second part of the question is a little bit like, to which extent is the historical grounding then also taken forward beyond Amel, especially in the Lebanese context, and maybe in your own work, because we didn't get to discuss that kind of the bringing those debates and also the notion of or the relation between hegemony and sectarianism into the present kind of.
Hicham, weren't you going to talk about this anyway, somewhat?
Yeah, but yeah, I'm just waiting if there's also more. I don't know what the time. What are we doing?
I think we can take another 15 minutes. I think that's fine.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I obviously understand if people have to go, but I think it'd be nice to finish up.
And
on
if someone,
these questions.
And please do interrupt me, the audience, if you haven't, want to speak and share your thoughts, please interrupt me, and we'd love to hear from you too.
Or just put your hands up while Hicham is speaking if you want, and then once he's him and Angela.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
So I would say, firstly, your point about the self-evidence point, which is obvious, and I completely understand what you mean. You're not actually undermining the work. It's like a white elephant. Maybe that's the best way to put it. That it's there. And I would say, firstly, it's interesting. We all use, not we, but the question of the Asiatic mode of production is all over the place. But we don't have about the colonial mode of production. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is, why is this an issue? Because when you say mode of production, you're not saying colonialism. You're going at the very basic infrastructure of how we understand relations of production. So people who are wedded to some kind of, like systematic understanding of the fundamentals of the superstructure and the infrastructure are going to be uneasy, very uneasy with this, because it's saying, oh, we're talking about the fundamental basic relations. And because Amel doesn't develop it extensively, then people can say, well, it's a nice idea, but it's not, it's not a fundamental intervention. So this question of the fundamental idea of a mode of production as transforming everything else, just like we say primitivism to feudalism. So if it's this big, it either doesn't get traction or it becomes the story. It's less likely to be just referred to in general. Not to add to the political economy of what circulates and what doesn't. Again, it doesn't get traction beyond a lot of what he does, and I don't know. That's an open question. Is it because of the language? Is it because of the power dynamics of where he was writing, the language he was writing in? So that's to the first point about the colonial mode of production, and the question of hegemony and domination, for example. And can it be useful today? Yes, I would say a big yes. Neo-colonialism, as we understand it, once we think of structural dependency and once we think of multiple temporalities, these two methodologies allow us to bring this wherever we want while being conscious of the concrete situation we have to be analyzing. So in the case of Lebanon, I actually talk about this in my article extensively. I'll just say that in many respects, Amel brings in the concept of hegemony, clearly from Gramsci, but he does things with it. And he cautions against this idea of, and I don't want to go too much into this now, but it's there in the article. Two things I would say. I use Amel when I speak about why there's a deadlock. He calls it a crisis. Okay, let me start from the beginning. The state, actually, he does talk about the state. I just said he doesn't mention the state, but he talks about it all the time in Lebanon. So I'm glad I made this corrective. He says, Lebanon is a sectarian bourgeois state. So the colonial mode of production, because sectarianism was institutionalized at the moment of imperialism, you have a state that is crisis-ridden structurally. It's not just, today or tomorrow. Why? Because the ruling class in Lebanon had to behave and act and to produce bourgeois consciousness. Its hegemonic discourse took the form of sectarian identity. So on one hand, it was a centrifugal force because sectarianism speaks about sects as independent of the state. On the other hand, it was a centripetal force because bourgeois state requires some form of centralization. It's these contradictory forces of bourgeois identity and sectarian identity, now we're analyzing them separately, but they're together, that creates a crisis-laden contradiction. And he says the idea of participation, sectarian participation, is an illusion, because to preserve the bourgeois, he says sectarianism first, the sect is the political relation of domination. That's how he defines the sect. And he says to preserve this relation of domination, the state has to constantly have a sect that's hegemonic. This idea of co-participation is an illusion. So even in the 80s, he says, this idea that the Shias or the Sunnis are calling for participation, no. Either you have Maronite hegemony and you have a congealed central state, or you're going to have a Shia hegemony, or you're going to have, and when he said, he never uses Shia, but I'm trying to simplify, or Sunni hegemony. And if you don't have that, you have fascism as an alternative through sectarian statelets, the decomposition of the state, which I think was misunderstood by his comrade Marxists who critiqued him on this in the 80s. They were saying, what state are you talking about? It doesn't exist anymore, etc. So you're saying, no. The sect only exists as a function of the state because it's a political relation. We're not talking about religious or cultural identities of how you feel, what you believe in. We're talking about an institutional relation. So actually today, after the death of Hariri, I've always argued in Lebanon, there's a hegemonic crisis because in the 90s, you had a pan-Syrian, you had the Syria that was keeping this hegemony together with of course, the condoning early on of the United States and Saudi Arabia. When the condoning ended in 2005, there was no more external hegemon, and you had a hegemonic crisis of rule. And that's what we have today. So it's very useful, I think, to understand what's happening today.
Thank you very much, Hicham. Did you want to add to that, Angela?
No, thank you, Hicham. That's great.
I mean, I think it's also really interesting in the broader sense, the difference, right? That the effort to really stretch, expand, and revise that categorical apparatus of Marxism has, rather than just an adjectival logic, right? So we have a lot of, so-called new histories of capitalism that are happy to talk about colonial capitalism and racial capitalism, but as something which suffuses, right, the empirical unfolding of these relations, but doesn't necessarily provide a categorical or analytical device, right? It's just, in a sense, is more of a recognition of what we should attend to, and that we should be conscious of the fact that there is no capitalism without forms of colonialism or imperialism or racialization, etc. But that's, I think, as you rightly alluded to, Hicham, very different than developing categorical and analytical apparatus that can then be mediated to give some orientation, let's say, right, in the case you just very clearly expounded now, how to analyze a particular moment, right, within
I want to point out also the question of this is maybe not exactly it, but the question of corruption of the elites that we are facing today and how we link them to global systems of dispossession and capitalism. It's so difficult now to convince a lot of the younger generation, at least in some parts of the world, of speaking about that. It's like, we've had enough of this colonialism. That's what I sometimes hear in some places and beyond the leftist circles. We've had enough. It's all these corrupt, the question of immediacy is so present. And it's something in the past. This colonialism is something, in the past. So I think this liberates us from the need to, have to explain it in ways that are not articulated in stretching it, like you said. We're not using the same terms. We're inventing new terms. But it's still hard to Amel says, and not just him, Nkrumah and everybody, the military, although we're back to it in the Middle East, we're back to military direct colonialism and occupation and war. But in many parts of the world, it's not as obvious. So that's why this is really key. And it's starting from the conditions on the ground is so key methodologically, but not staying there. You start there, you go to theory, you come back, and you keep doing this, which we don't do as often because it.
Please.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for the discussion. I'm coming to this very new, but I found it fascinating. I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to how his work was taken up regionally amongst Arab Marxists, whether it was or wasn't, and how that played out.
You might, maybe you joined us a bit later. We talked very briefly about that. And both of us, I think, said we don't have enough to build on. I think Angela did speak about Egypt and in relation to state-linked Marxist work. I would say, so it was taken up. You see references to it by Tahir Labib. You see references to it in Egypt. It's there, but it's not, as far as I know, again, widely circulated beyond these narrow circles of intellectuals. I'm talking about his time period. He's now much more popular, I think. Exactly. But that's my understanding of it. And I'm still ignorant of, I haven't done the cultural history of it as much as I've done the intellectual history of the work.
Okay, thanks.
I
would just say today, or I should say today, like for the past, I've been spending lots of time in Egypt, and I spent a lot of time in Syria since 2010, in 2008, 2010. Since then, Mahdi Amel is among young intellectuals and the younger professors. It's not just 30 somethings now. It's also somewhat older, but is very, very, very widely read, and not just among people who identify as leftists.
Thank you.
I had a question that maybe I should have asked at the moment of the intellectual profile of Amel's own history, and it sort of comes also from the fact that we're discussing this in the context of a center for philosophy, amongst other things. And I was very intrigued when I found out, reading I believe the preface or one of the introductions to your collection, that Amel has studied, or had done his dissertation rather than studied, with Henri Maldinet in Lyon, and then had moved to Algeria, right? Because there's a curious there's an inevitable resonance, not least because you mentioned his also his reading and interest in Fanon at some point, or at least certain resonances, with the fact that Fanon had followed Merleau-Ponty's courses in Lyon about a decade earlier, before he had in turn moved to Algeria. So I was just wondering, in terms of Amel's style of thought, right, for want of a better term, how do you assess the presence or not, right? Not just of a Marxist, Marxian literature and tradition, but maybe of philosophy more broadly, whether in the style of his thinking, concept formation, whether it's phenomenology or other traditions. Is that something that one can sense or see in his kind of mature text, or in his readings, or in his references, and also maybe if there was any, if you had anything to say about, partly because you were discussing the question of national bourgeoisies and colonialist bourgeoisies, whether Fanon would have been a point of reference or dialogue for him.
Hicham, do you want to say something about the critique of Fanon?
No, yeah, but if you want to also talk more about the philosophical and intellectual.
I'll say this. And again, I know this just because it's my interest. And Mahdi Amel does appear to have read and have been interested in kind of classical, like Arab-Muslim philosophy, Islamic philosophy. There are some interesting citations here and there, and he's clearly aware and kind of like formulating his lexicon and of this tradition. But again, I just kind of put that in the bucket, in the like how widely read he was, and how like conscious he was of like of terminology, of kind of concept formation and coinage. He wanted to be aware of this tradition, as he was aware of, what Althusser was writing, and it's part of his, I'm not saying he's like some, I'm not trying to make some claim about his interest in classical Islamic philosophy, but it's there too. Like he is very much a philosopher and kind of engaged in this way that differentiates him, in my reading, especially the kind of more mainstream state affiliated Marxists that I have read in the Egyptian context.
I want to build on that and say, firstly, in my view, he does have a very Socratic approach to writing, but like the dynamics of how he writes is very dialogical. It's very much so. So there is that first observation. This is a subjective observation. The second observation is precisely what Angela said about this. And by the way, his closest comrade and friend and intellectual was Hussein Marwa, who was the authority on the history of Islamic and Arab philosophy. And he wrote an incredibly important study of the materialist tendencies of Islamic philosophy, a Marxist, who was also assassinated 6 months before the assassination of Amel. So this was very much a project of, and this will bring us to the question of Turath, heritage, that Amel was, unlike other Marxists of the time, Arab Marxists, and Marwa too, they said Turath, heritage. The problem of cultural heritage is a problem of the present. It's not in the past. The Avicennas and Averroes of the past never even had to bother with it. And it's a question of colonialism and civilisation, mission civilisatrice. So there's that dynamic of bringing resurrecting, so to speak, or redefining Turath in a way. But also he was dealing with the Islamist currents. So although Marwa does more of that. Now to go to the canon, the European canon, which I think Alberto and others know a lot more about than I do. This canon itself, of course, he was immersed in that. Now he was much more, I think, in conversation with Marxist philosophers who had a philosophical bent, but not necessarily maybe other philosophies. I don't know. I'm sure he read them. Fanon, by the way, we went back to the text of Fanon to figure out what to use for metropolitan, because when we thought of colonialist bourgeoisie, I was a bit, I found it there. We found it there. And then we had a conversation about that. And this helped us use the term because there was a precedence. On the other hand, one of the drawbacks is Amel does not reference most of his work. He will not tell you who he's talking about. The person he probably references explicitly the most is Gramsci, not Fanon. There is a reference to Fanon, a citation of Fanon at some point. He critiques Jack Burke and others for using the word decolonization. He says it has this connotation of going back to an authentic past. And he says we need to use the word liberation. So we cannot go to our past. We don't, and this goes back to, I think, the early question, forgive me, I forgot the name, about what is his vision of change. His vision was not a return to a pre-colonial past, authentic past. His vision was socialism in its modern form, but liberated from capitalism. So these are the influences one could discern, but he's, you don't see Samir Amin anywhere. I don't know if this is just a personal thing or it's a way of writing, or he doesn't, also we have to remember the way ideas circulate in many of these intellectuals who are also comrades and activists. They're not as concerned with, citing and going back to who did what. They're part of this, and for them it's the national liberation struggle, and whoever writes whatever it's more on the content of the ideas and less on who owns them.
Okay, well, maybe on that note, we'll close what I think has been a really fascinating conversation. So I really wanted to thank Angela and Hicham for speaking to us about their project, which I heartily welcome everybody to get a copy of, especially that now it's actually affordable.
And in a better edited, it's better. It's just better. The book is so much better.
It's just better, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So for those of you who are not on the mailing list, please get on if you want to find out about further events. So thank you, Hicham and Angela, if you wanted to stay.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you. This was really wonderful. I really enjoyed this.
I did too. Thank you for your hospitality and the conversation, and I wish you all the best with this seminar.
Thanks.
Take care.